3.2 seconds. That's how long Maya Rodriguez had to make a decision that would either save her daughter's life or watch her die in front of 100 strangers. This wheelchair you're looking at belongs to 7-year-old Isabella Rodriguez, and in exactly 3 seconds it will begin rolling toward the busiest intersection in downtown Chicago. The man who pushed it? John Everett, one of the wealthiest hedge fund managers in Illinois, father to 5-year-old Emily Everett. This moment, captured on 17 different cell phones, would spark a national debate about privilege, prejudice, and parental desperation. But what those grainy videos didn't capture, what the media refused to investigate, what the police buried in their reports, was the real reason John Everett attacked a disabled child in broad daylight. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most shocking crimes are committed by the people who seem to have everything to lose. And the final revelation will force you to question everything you think you know about justice, mercy, and the lengths a parent will go to protect their child. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Saturday, September 15th, 2023. Lincoln Park, Chicago. Two families whose worlds should never have intersected were about to collide in the most devastating way possible. Maya Rodriguez, 34 years old, had just finished her 3rd consecutive night shift at Chicago General Hospital. As a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit, she'd seen more childhood suffering than most people could imagine. Her daughter Isabella was born with spina bifida, a condition that left her partially paralyzed from the waist down. Every weekend without fail, Maya would bring Isabella to this park because it was one of the few places in their neighborhood with wheelchair-accessible playground equipment. But this wasn't just about accessibility. Maya had discovered that Isabella possessed an extraordinary gift for dance. Despite her physical limitations when music played, Isabella would move her arms and upper body with such grace and passion that crowds would stop to watch. These impromptu performances had become Isabella's way of feeling normal, feeling beautiful, feeling like she belonged in a world that often stared at her wheelchair before seeing her smile. 12 blocks away, in a $20 million penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, John Everett was preparing for what he knew might be his final weekend with his daughter Emily. At 48 years old, John controlled over $2 billion in assets through Everett Capital Management. He owned homes in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Monaco. His watch collection was worth more than most people's houses, but none of that wealth could solve the problem that was slowly destroying his carefully constructed life. 3 months earlier, his ex-wife Catherine had filed for full custody of Emily, claiming that John's obsessive work schedule and recent erratic behavior made him an unfit father. The custody hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and John's lawyers had already prepared him for the worst-case scenario. This weekend in the park wasn't just a father-daughter outing. It was potentially his last chance to create a happy memory with the only person in his life who still looked at him with unconditional love. What neither family knew was that their paths had already crossed in the most unlikely place. 2 weeks earlier, Isabella Rodriguez had been rushed to Chicago General with complications from her condition. The attending physician was Dr. Catherine Everett, John's ex-wife. Catherine had spent 4 hours in surgery, saving Isabella's life, while Maya sat in the waiting room praying to every saint she could remember. During Isabella's recovery, Catherine had noticed something remarkable about the little girl's spirit and determination. She'd mentioned to her colleagues that Isabella reminded her of her own daughter Emily, who was also fighting her own invisible battle. You see, Emily Everett wasn't just any 5-year-old. She'd been diagnosed with selective mutism following her parents' explosive divorce, the trauma of watching her father's business deals take precedence over family dinners, of hearing her mother cry behind closed doors, of being shuffled between nannies while her parents fought over asset divisions, had left Emily unable to speak in most social situations. John Everett, the man who could negotiate million-dollar deals with a single phone call, was helpless when it came to drawing words from his own daughter's lips. 2:47 p.m. Isabella Rodriguez began her dance routine to a pop song playing from a small Bluetooth speaker her mother had brought. Within minutes, a crowd of 15 people had gathered, drawn by the pure joy radiating from this little girl who refused to let her wheelchair define her limitations. Among the spectators was 5-year-old Emily Everett, who had wandered away from the bench where her father was absorbed in yet another business call. For Emily, watching Isabella dance was like seeing magic happen in real time. Here was another little girl, roughly her age, commanding attention not through tantrums or demands but through pure artistic expression. For the first time in months, Emily felt compelled to participate rather than observe. She began moving to the music, mimicking Isabella's arm movements, and something extraordinary happened. Emily began to hum. It was barely audible, but it was the first voluntary sound she'd made in public since the divorce proceedings began. John Everett ended his call and looked up to find his daughter 20 feet away, engaging with a group of strangers. His immediate reaction wasn't pride or joy at seeing Emily's breakthrough. It was fear. In John's world, strangers were potential threats, unknown variables that could disrupt carefully controlled environments. His paranoia had been amplified by recent death threats from investors who'd lost money in his hedge fund's latest downturn. Every unfamiliar face was a potential danger to his daughter's safety. But there was something else driving John's reaction, something he'd never admitted to his therapists or lawyers. He was terrified of losing control over Emily's narrative. In his mind, Emily's selective mutism was a temporary setback that expensive therapy and private tutors would eventually resolve. Seeing her respond positively to a disabled child challenged his worldview that money and status were the primary solutions to life's problems. Maya Rodriguez watched the interaction between the two girls with the trained eye of a pediatric nurse. She recognized the signs of selective mutism in Emily immediately, and understood that Isabella's uninhibited joy was creating a safe space for this obviously troubled little girl. When Isabella extended her hand to invite Emily to join her in the center of their impromptu stage, Maya felt a familiar surge of maternal pride. Her daughter had an innate ability to see past surface differences and connect with others who were struggling. It was a gift that had emerged from Isabella's own experiences with feeling different and excluded. But Maya also noticed the tall man in the expensive suit approaching with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking control of situations. Every instinct she'd developed from years of dealing with entitled parents in hospital settings told her that this confrontation would not end peacefully. What happened next was captured on multiple cell phones, but each video told a slightly different story depending on the angle and the timing. John Everett approached the two girls and, in a voice loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, said, "Emily, get away from that crippled girl right now." The word crippled hit Maya like a physical blow, not because she hadn't heard it before, but because Isabella heard it too. Maya watched her daughter's face crumble as the joy she'd been radiating transformed instantly into shame and confusion. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Maya Rodriguez had spent 7 years teaching her daughter to be proud of her differences, to see her wheelchair as a tool rather than a limitation, to understand that her worth wasn't determined by other people's prejudices. But in one sentence, this stranger had attempted to undo years of careful confidence building. John Everett's intentions, twisted as they were, hadn't been primarily malicious. In his mind, he was protecting Emily from what he perceived as an uncomfortable situation. His own discomfort with disability stemmed from his childhood, when his younger brother had died from muscular dystrophy. John had never processed that trauma, instead choosing to build walls of wealth and status that he believed would protect his family from similar suffering. Seeing Emily drawn to another child with physical challenges triggered panic responses that had nothing to do with Isabella personally, and everything to do with John's unresolved grief. But impact matters more than intention, and the impact of his words was about to create consequences none of them could have anticipated. Maya Rodriguez stood up from the bench where she'd been watching, and her response wasn't the explosive anger that most parents would have felt. Instead, it was the calculated composure of someone who'd spent years advocating for her daughter in medical settings, where emotional reactions were often dismissed as hysteria. She approached John Everett and said, in a voice steady enough to cut through his privilege, "My daughter's name is Isabella, and she has more courage in her little finger than you've shown your daughter in her entire life." The crowd of onlookers began to shift uncomfortably, sensing that this confrontation was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. Cell phones came out, not initially to record a viral moment, but because people instinctively document situations that feel dangerous and unpredictable. John's response revealed the depth of his panic and poor judgment. Instead of recognizing that his initial comment had been inappropriate and apologizing, he doubled down. "I don't care what her name is," he said, his voice rising with each word. "My daughter doesn't need to be around people like that. It's disturbing." This second attack wasn't just about Isabella's disability anymore. It was John Everett's way of reasserting control over a situation where he felt powerless. In his business world, he could end conversations by writing checks or making threats. But Maya Rodriguez wasn't intimidated by his expensive clothes or his obvious wealth, and that unfamiliarity left him feeling more threatened than he'd felt in years. What the cell phone videos couldn't capture was the conversation happening at knee level between Isabella and Emily. Despite her father's commands, Emily hadn't moved away from Isabella. Instead, she'd gotten down to Isabella's eye level and was whispering something in her ear. Later, when investigators pieced together the timeline, they would learn that Emily was apologizing for her father's behavior and asking Isabella not to stop dancing. This 5-year-old girl, who hadn't spoken voluntarily in months, was finding her voice to defend someone she'd just met. The irony was devastating. John Everett was so focused on protecting his daughter from what he perceived as a negative influence that he completely missed the positive breakthrough happening right in front of him. Maya's next decision would be analyzed by legal experts, parenting blogs, and social media commentators for months afterward. She chose to educate rather than retaliate. She knelt down beside both girls and began explaining to Emily, in age-appropriate terms, what spina bifida was and how Isabella's wheelchair helped her move around and live a full life. Her intent was to demystify disability for this obviously sheltered little girl and to model the kind of respectful interaction that Emily clearly wasn't learning at home. But to John Everett, watching a stranger have intimate conversations with his daughter felt like a violation of boundaries he'd spent years establishing. His paranoia, already heightened by business pressures and custody fears, transformed this educational moment into what he perceived as a direct threat to his parental authority. The situation reached its breaking point when Emily asked Isabella if she could try sitting in the wheelchair. It was an innocent request born from curiosity and connection, but John Everett interpreted it as his daughter being manipulated by strangers with unknown motives. This was the moment when his protective instincts overwhelmed his judgment completely. He reached down to grab Emily's arm, intending to pull her away from Isabella once and for all. But Emily, emboldened by her new friendship and frustrated by months of being controlled and silenced, did something unprecedented. She said no to her father, loudly, clearly, and with the kind of defiance that shocked everyone present, including Emily herself. John Everett's reaction to his daughter's defiance was swift and disproportionate. In his mind, Emily's public rejection of his authority represented everything that was going wrong in his carefully controlled life. His ex-wife was challenging his custody rights, his business was facing federal investigation for insider trading, and now his own daughter was choosing strangers over his protection. The emotional dam he'd built around years of accumulated stress and unprocessed trauma finally burst. Instead of simply picking up Emily and leaving the park, John made a decision that would haunt him forever. He shoved Isabella's wheelchair with enough force to send it rolling toward the park's exit, which opened directly onto Michigan Avenue, one of Chicago's busiest streets. The physics of what happened next would be analyzed frame by frame in court proceedings. Isabella's wheelchair, a manual model that relied on handbrakes that a 7-year-old couldn't operate while in motion, gained momentum as it rolled down the slight incline leading to the street. Maya Rodriguez had exactly 3.2 seconds to react before her daughter would roll into traffic moving at 35 miles per hour. Her first instinct was to run after the wheelchair, but she realized immediately that she couldn't reach it in time. Her second option was to scream for help, but the weekend crowd was too absorbed in their own activities to process and respond to her panic quickly enough. The third option, the one that would save Isabella's life and change Maya's forever, required her to put her own body between the wheelchair and the intersection. Maya Rodriguez threw herself into the path of the runaway wheelchair with the calculated precision of someone who'd spent years making split-second medical decisions under pressure. The collision knocked her to the ground hard enough to fracture 2 ribs and her left wrist, but it stopped Isabella's wheelchair less than 3 feet from the curb. The 17 different cell phone videos that captured this moment would show Maya's heroic sacrifice, but they couldn't record the whispered words Isabella spoke to her mother as Maya lay on the ground, struggling to breathe through the pain. "Mama, I'm sorry I made you hurt." 7 years old, and Isabella's immediate response to her mother's injury was to assume responsibility for the traumatic situation they'd been forced into through no fault of their own. John Everett stood frozen as he watched the aftermath of his actions unfold. Emily had broken free from his grip and was running toward Isabella and Maya, her voice finally unleashed as she screamed for help. The crowd that had been passively recording the confrontation suddenly mobilized into action, calling 911, offering first aid, and creating a protective barrier around the injured mother and traumatized child. But it was Emily Everett's reaction that would haunt John for the rest of his life. When the paramedics arrived and began treating Maya's injuries, Emily refused to leave Isabella's side. This 5-year-old girl, who had been selectively mute for months, became Isabella's translator, explaining to the EMTs that Isabella couldn't feel her legs but that her arms hurt from gripping the wheelchair during the collision. The final image captured on all 17 cell phone videos was of 2 little girls holding hands as Maya Rodriguez was loaded into an ambulance, while John Everett stood alone, abandoned by his own daughter, surrounded by a crowd of strangers who had witnessed him attack a disabled child and nearly cause her death. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Because what none of those witnesses knew, what wouldn't be discovered until weeks later during the criminal investigation, was that John Everett's attack on Isabella wasn't random violence born from prejudice and privilege. It was the desperate action of a man who had recognized Maya Rodriguez the moment she'd approached him in the park, and who knew that she held the power to destroy the carefully constructed lies that his entire custody case was built upon. Detective Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years investigating cases that made headlines, but the video footage from Lincoln Park presented her with a puzzle that defied easy categorization. On the surface, John Everett appeared to be a textbook case of entitled aggression, a wealthy man whose prejudice against disability had led him to assault a child. The 17 cell phone videos provided multiple angles of the same basic narrative. Rich father attacks poor disabled daughter. Heroic mother saves child. But Detective Martinez had learned long ago that viral videos rarely tell complete stories, and there were details about this case that didn't fit the simple narrative everyone seemed eager to embrace. The first red flag was John Everett's behavior in the hours immediately following the incident. Most perpetrators of assault, especially those caught on video, either flee the scene or begin constructing alibis and justifications for their actions. John had done neither. He'd remained at the park until police arrived, made no attempt to contact his lawyers, and when questioned by the first responding officers, his primary concern hadn't been his legal liability. Instead, he'd repeatedly asked about Maya Rodriguez's injuries and whether Isabella had been hurt beyond the trauma of the incident. This wasn't the behavior pattern Detective Martinez typically saw from perpetrators who acted from malice or prejudice. This was the behavior of someone consumed by guilt and regret, someone whose actions had surprised even himself. The second anomaly emerged when Detective Martinez began investigating John Everett's background. A man with his wealth and status would typically have a trail of similar incidents, complaints from service workers, lawsuits from business partners, or at minimum, a reputation for arrogance and entitlement. But John's public record was remarkably clean. His business dealings, while aggressive, were considered ethical by industry standards. His ex-wife, Catherine, despite filing for divorce and seeking full custody, had never accused him of physical violence or abusive behavior toward her or Emily. The picture that emerged was of a man who was emotionally distant and professionally obsessed, but not someone with a history of attacking strangers or expressing prejudice against disabled individuals. Detective Martinez decided to examine the timeline more carefully, starting with the 2 weeks leading up to the incident. What she discovered would eventually unravel the entire case, but it began with a simple administrative detail that almost everyone else had overlooked. John Everett's phone records showed that he had received 4 calls from Chicago General Hospital between September 1st and September 13th. 3 of those calls had lasted less than 30 seconds, consistent with voicemails or brief updates. But the 4th call, received on September 13th at 11:15 p.m., had lasted 17 minutes. Hospital protocol required detailed records of all extended patient consultations, but when Detective Martinez requested the corresponding documentation, she was told that no such records existed for John Everett or his daughter Emily. The missing hospital records led Detective Martinez to Maya Rodriguez, whose own phone records revealed an equally puzzling pattern. On the same night that John had received his 17-minute call from the hospital, Maya had worked an unscheduled overtime shift that lasted until 4 a.m. Her time card showed that she'd been assigned to the pediatric oncology ward, a department she rarely worked in due to her specialization in spina bifida cases and mobility disorders. When Detective Martinez cross-referenced the hospital's patient admissions for that week, she discovered that Emily Everett had been brought to the emergency room on September 13th at 10:45 p.m., just 30 minutes before her father received that mysterious 17-minute phone call. The medical records that Detective Martinez eventually obtained through a court order painted a picture that transformed the entire case from a simple assault into something far more complex and heartbreaking. Emily Everett had been admitted with severe dehydration, unexplained bruising, and what the emergency room physician had initially suspected might be signs of physical abuse. The standard protocol in such cases required immediate involvement of Child Protective Services and a comprehensive evaluation by the hospital's pediatric trauma team. But the attending physician who had examined Emily that night was Dr. Catherine Everett, John's ex-wife, and the nurse who had been assigned to Emily's care was Maya Rodriguez. What happened during Emily's 6-hour stay at Chicago General would explain everything that occurred in Lincoln Park 2 days later, but it would also raise questions about professional ethics, family loyalty, and the impossible choices that medical professionals sometimes face when treating the children of people they know personally. Maya Rodriguez had recognized Emily immediately, not just because she bore a striking resemblance to her father, but because Maya had been present during several of the custody hearings where Catherine had testified about John's emotional distance and inability to connect with his daughter. Maya had attended these hearings not as a witness but as emotional support for Catherine, who had become both a colleague and a friend during their years working together at Chicago General. When Maya examined Emily that night, she discovered something that Dr. Catherine Everett had either missed or chosen not to document officially. The bruises on Emily's arms weren't consistent with physical abuse. They were consistent with a child who had been injecting herself with insulin. The dehydration wasn't from neglect. It was from diabetic ketoacidosis, a potentially fatal condition that occurs when the body can't produce or properly use insulin. Emily Everett, 5 years old, had been living with type 1 diabetes for months, possibly years, and had been managing her condition in secret, terrified of adding another burden to her already fractured family. Maya Rodriguez faced an ethical dilemma that would have challenged even the most experienced medical professional. She could follow standard protocol, document her suspicions about Emily's diabetes, and trigger a cascade of medical interventions and legal procedures that would likely result in Emily being removed from both parents' custody pending further investigation. Or she could approach Dr. Catherine Everett directly, share her concerns, and allow Emily's mother to handle the situation as both a physician and a parent. Maya chose the latter option, and that 17-minute phone call to John Everett was Catherine calling to inform him that his daughter had a chronic medical condition that would require lifelong management, and that Emily had been hiding her illness because she was afraid of causing more problems for her parents. John Everett's reaction to learning about Emily's diabetes explained everything that had seemed irrational about his behavior in the park. The man who had appeared to be motivated by prejudice and privilege had actually been consumed by guilt and terror. For months, he had attributed Emily's withdrawal and selective mutism to the trauma of the divorce, never suspecting that his daughter was also fighting a medical battle that she felt she had to face alone. The revelation that Emily had been giving herself insulin injections in secret, that she had been monitoring her blood sugar levels and restricting her diet without any adult guidance, had shattered John's understanding of himself as a father and as a protector. When John Everett saw Maya Rodriguez approach him in Lincoln Park, his initial reaction wasn't anger or prejudice. It was recognition and panic. He knew exactly who she was. Maya had been present at every custody hearing, sitting in the gallery behind Catherine, offering silent support to the woman who was trying to take Emily away from him. But more importantly, Maya had been the nurse who had discovered Emily's secret, the person whose phone call to Catherine had set in motion a series of revelations that had made John question everything about his ability to be a father. In John's mind, distorted by guilt and desperation, Maya Rodriguez represented judgment and exposure. She had seen his daughter at her most vulnerable, had witnessed the evidence of John's failure to notice that Emily was seriously ill, and now she was here in the park, where John was trying to create one last positive memory with his daughter before Monday's custody hearing. The rational part of John's mind understood that Maya was simply a nurse who had been doing her job, but the frightened, guilty part of his mind saw her presence as a threat to his already fragile relationship with Emily. What John didn't know was that Maya's discovery of Emily's diabetes had actually worked in his favor during the custody proceedings. When Dr. Catherine Everett had been forced to confront the reality that her own daughter had been managing a serious medical condition in secret, she had begun to question whether the divorce and custody battle had created too much instability and stress for Emily to handle. Catherine had realized that Emily's selective mutism wasn't just a response to her parents' marital problems, but also a symptom of a child who felt responsible for holding her family together and was terrified of adding any additional burdens to an already overwhelming situation. Maya Rodriguez had spent the days following Emily's hospital admission, researching the psychological impact of childhood diabetes on family dynamics, and what she'd learned had convinced her that Emily's best chance for healthy adjustment to her diagnosis lay in having both parents actively involved in her care. Against her personal loyalty to Catherine, Maya had actually recommended to the court that John be given significant custody time, specifically so that Emily wouldn't feel like her illness had caused her to lose access to her father. Maya's professional opinion, documented in a report that John had never seen, had been instrumental in convincing the judge to reject Catherine's request for sole custody. The tragic irony of what happened in Lincoln Park was that John Everett had attacked the very person who had been advocating for his parental rights. Maya Rodriguez, the woman he perceived as his enemy, had actually been working to keep his family together. Her presence in the park that day had nothing to do with the custody case or any desire to monitor John's parenting. She was simply a mother bringing her disabled daughter to one of the few accessible playgrounds in their neighborhood, completely unaware that she would encounter the family whose lives had become entangled with hers through a series of coincidences and medical emergencies. When Emily Everett had approached Isabella Rodriguez and begun dancing with her, it represented a breakthrough that should have filled John with hope and pride. For months, Emily had been withdrawn and silent, carrying the weight of her medical secret and her guilt about her parents' divorce. But Isabella's joy and uninhibited self-expression had created a safe space where Emily felt free to participate and even to vocalize her enjoyment. This was exactly the kind of social interaction that Dr. Catherine Everett and the family therapist had been hoping Emily would experience. But John's fear and guilt had prevented him from recognizing the positive nature of what was happening. Maya Rodriguez had also failed to recognize the significance of the moment, but for different reasons. As a pediatric nurse, she was focused on Emily's obvious signs of selective mutism and was pleased to see the little girl responding positively to Isabella's inclusive energy. Maya had no idea that this was John Everett's daughter, the child whose medical crisis she had helped navigate just days earlier. If she had made the connection, she might have approached John directly, perhaps even thanked him for allowing Emily to participate in Isabella's dance, and the entire tragic confrontation might have been avoided. The truth about what really happened in Lincoln Park emerged 3 weeks after the incident, during a court-ordered psychological evaluation of John Everett. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist specializing in trauma-induced behavioral disorders, had been asked to assess whether John's attack on Isabella Rodriguez represented a pattern of violent behavior or an isolated incident triggered by specific stressors. What Dr. Williams discovered during her sessions with John would eventually lead to all criminal charges being dropped, but not because John was found innocent of assault. The charges were dropped because Maya Rodriguez herself requested that they be dismissed after learning the full context of John's mental state at the time of the attack. During his psychological evaluation, John Everett revealed details about Emily's diabetes diagnosis that hadn't been included in any of the official medical or legal records. The night Emily had been hospitalized, she had been found unconscious in her bedroom by John's housekeeper, who had called 911 while John was at a business dinner 40 miles away. By the time John reached the hospital, Emily had been stabilized, but she was still unconscious, and the doctors weren't certain whether she would suffer any permanent neurological damage from the prolonged period of extremely high blood sugar. John had spent that entire night in the pediatric ICU, watching his daughter breathe with the assistance of machines, knowing that her condition was the result of his failure to notice that she had been sick for months. The guilt was compounded when the medical team explained that Emily had likely been experiencing symptoms of diabetes for over a year, symptoms that John had attributed to normal childhood development or stress from the divorce. Emily's frequent urination, excessive thirst, weight loss, and fatigue had all been dismissed by John as temporary issues that would resolve once the custody situation was settled. But the revelation that had truly broken John's psychological defenses came when Emily woke up the next morning, and her first words were an apology. She had said, "Daddy, I'm sorry I got sick. I didn't want to make you and Mommy more sad." This 5-year-old girl, fighting a life-threatening medical condition, was taking responsibility for her parents' emotional well-being and trying to protect them from additional stress. John realized in that moment that his daughter had been functioning as the emotional caretaker for their entire family, sacrificing her own health and safety to avoid being perceived as a burden. Maya Rodriguez's role in Emily's care had extended far beyond the single night shift when she discovered the diabetes. Over the following days, Maya had volunteered to work additional hours specifically to be available for Emily's care, recognizing that the little girl needed consistency and emotional support during a frightening time. Maya had been the one to teach Emily how to properly administer her insulin injections, how to test her blood sugar levels, and most importantly, how to communicate her needs to adults without feeling guilty or burdensome. When Dr. Williams shared these details with Maya Rodriguez during the legal proceedings, Maya's perspective on John's attack shifted completely. She began to understand that John's assault on Isabella hadn't been motivated by hatred or prejudice, but by a father's desperate attempt to control the one aspect of Emily's life that he felt capable of managing. John had perceived Maya as a threat not because of any rational assessment of danger, but because she represented his own inadequacy as a parent and his fear that Emily would be better cared for by strangers than by her own father. Maya Rodriguez made a decision that surprised everyone involved in the case, including her own legal team. She requested a meeting with John Everett, not to confront him about the attack, but to help him understand Emily's medical needs and to offer her support in developing a care plan that would allow Emily to maintain relationships with both parents while managing her diabetes effectively. This meeting, which took place in Dr. Williams's office under controlled circumstances, would lead to an outcome that no one involved in the case could have anticipated when the viral videos first started circulating on social media. The meeting between Maya Rodriguez and John Everett took place on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 2 months after the incident in Lincoln Park. Isabella Rodriguez was present at her own request because she wanted to meet Emily again under different circumstances. Emily Everett was also there, accompanied by both of her parents, who had agreed to a temporary truce in their custody battle to focus on Emily's medical and emotional needs. What happened during that 90-minute session would fundamentally change the trajectory of both families' lives and challenge everyone's assumptions about forgiveness, justice, and the possibility of healing after trauma. Isabella Rodriguez, 7 years old and confined to a wheelchair, was the first person to speak when the families were brought together. She looked directly at John Everett and said, "My mama says you were scared about your little girl being sick and that's why you pushed my chair. I get scared about being sick too sometimes." This statement, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that often emerges from children who have faced significant challenges, immediately shifted the emotional dynamic in the room from confrontational to compassionate. John Everett's response was to drop to his knees beside Isabella's wheelchair and, with tears streaming down his face, offer the most sincere apology that anyone present had ever witnessed. He didn't attempt to justify his actions or minimize the trauma he had caused. Instead, he took full responsibility for his behavior and asked Isabella if there was anything he could do to help her feel safe again. Isabella's response was simple but profound. She said, "You can help Emily not be scared about her diabetes. I have spina bifida, and it's not scary when grown-ups know how to help." Emily Everett, who had been silent throughout most of the custody proceedings and psychological evaluations, finally found her voice during this meeting. She began talking about her diabetes, her fears about being different from other children, and her guilt about causing problems for her parents. But she also talked about Isabella's dancing and how it had made her feel like being different could be beautiful rather than shameful. The connection between the two girls, which had been interrupted so violently in the park, was reestablished in this controlled environment where both children felt safe to express their feelings and fears. Maya Rodriguez proposed something that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She offered to provide diabetes education and support for John Everett, not as part of any legal settlement or court mandate, but as one parent helping another navigate the challenges of raising a child with a chronic medical condition. Maya had recognized that John's attack on Isabella, while inexcusable, had emerged from the same fears and desperation that she herself had experienced when Isabella was first diagnosed with spina bifida. The only difference was that Maya had been surrounded by medical professionals and support systems that had helped her process those fears constructively, while John had been isolated by his wealth and his assumption that he should be able to handle everything independently. Dr. Catherine Everett, who had been witnessing this interaction as both Emily's mother and a physician, made a decision that would shock the legal teams representing both sides of the custody battle. She withdrew her request for sole custody and instead proposed a collaborative parenting plan that would allow Emily to maintain close relationships with both parents while ensuring that her medical needs were properly managed. Catherine had realized that Emily's diabetes management would be more successful if both parents were equally educated and involved, and that the stability Emily needed could only come from ending the adversarial nature of the custody proceedings. The final resolution of the case was unlike anything that had been anticipated when the viral videos first started circulating. John Everett pled guilty to assault charges but was sentenced to community service, specifically focused on disability awareness and advocacy. Maya Rodriguez and Isabella became regular volunteers with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, where Maya's nursing expertise and Isabella's natural ability to connect with other children created a powerful support system for families dealing with recent diagnoses. But the most remarkable outcome was the friendship that developed between Isabella and Emily. The two girls, who had met during a moment of joy that was interrupted by adult fears and trauma, were able to rebuild their connection in an environment where their differences were celebrated rather than feared. Emily's selective mutism gradually resolved as she gained confidence in managing her diabetes, while Isabella found a new purpose in helping other children understand that medical conditions didn't have to define their entire identity or limit their dreams. 6 months after the incident in Lincoln Park, Isabella Rodriguez and Emily Everett performed a dance routine together at the annual Chicago Children's Hospital fundraising gala. The performance, choreographed to incorporate Isabella's wheelchair and Emily's insulin pump, was a celebration of resilience, friendship, and the possibility of transformation even after trauma. John Everett and Maya Rodriguez sat together in the audience, not as former adversaries, but as parents who had learned that their children's well-being was more important than their own pride or fear. The viral videos that had initially sparked national outrage about privilege and prejudice were eventually overshadowed by a different kind of story, one about the complexity of human motivation and the possibility of redemption through understanding and compassion. Maya Rodriguez never sought financial compensation from John Everett, despite her medical bills and lost wages from the incident. Instead, she accepted his offer to fund a scholarship program for nursing students specializing in pediatric chronic illness care, ensuring that other families would have access to the kind of informed, compassionate support that had ultimately brought healing to both of their families. John Everett's business empire survived the scandal, but John himself was fundamentally changed by the experience. He reduced his work schedule significantly, sold 2 of his homes, and redirected much of his wealth toward organizations supporting families affected by childhood chronic illnesses. His relationship with Emily, which had been strained by years of emotional distance and recent trauma, gradually strengthened as they worked together to manage her diabetes and repair the trust that had been damaged by his actions in the park. The question that had haunted everyone involved in the case was whether justice had truly been served. John Everett had committed assault against a disabled child and nearly caused her death, yet he had avoided prison and was now celebrated by some as an example of successful rehabilitation. Maya Rodriguez had forgiven the man who had attacked her daughter, but critics argued that her forgiveness came at the expense of accountability for John's actions. Isabella Rodriguez had been traumatized by an adult's violence, yet she seemed to have recovered more quickly and completely than anyone had expected. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated John Everett, eventually published a case study based on the incident that became required reading in graduate programs focused on crisis intervention and family therapy. Her conclusion was that traditional concepts of justice, focused on punishment and retribution, were inadequate for addressing cases where trauma and desperation had led to actions that were both inexcusable and understandable. The real measure of justice, Dr. Williams argued, was whether the victims had been made whole and whether society had been made safer, not whether the perpetrator had suffered proportionally to the harm they had caused. Today, Isabella Rodriguez is 10 years old and continues to dance, now incorporating her wheelchair into performances that have been featured in national competitions and television specials. Emily Everett is 8 years old and manages her diabetes with the confidence and competence that comes from having a strong support system and adults who understand her condition. Maya Rodriguez continues working as a pediatric nurse and has become a national speaker on the topics of disability advocacy and medical family support. John Everett remains actively involved in Emily's life and has developed a reputation as one of Chicago's most generous supporters of children's medical charities. The 3.2 seconds that had initially seemed to represent the time Maya Rodriguez had to save her daughter's life ultimately came to represent something much larger. The brief moment when fear, trauma, and misunderstanding can either destroy lives permanently or create opportunities for healing that seemed impossible just moments before. The choice of how to respond to that moment, made not just by Maya, but by everyone involved in the aftermath, determined whether the incident would be remembered as a tragedy that reinforced society's divisions or as a difficult but ultimately hopeful story about the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, and transformation even in the most unlikely circumstances. The 17 cell phone videos that captured that September afternoon in Lincoln Park are still available online, still generating comments and debate from viewers who weren't present for the complex story that unfolded in the months that followed. Some viewers see evidence of privilege and prejudice that deserved harsher punishment. Others see a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging complex human situations based on brief, viral moments. But for the families involved, those videos represent something entirely different. The moment when their lives intersected in trauma and somehow found their way to healing. Maya Rodriguez has said in interviews that she doesn't regret her decision to forgive John Everett, not because his actions were justified, but because forgiveness allowed her and Isabella to move forward without carrying the weight of anger and resentment. John Everett has said that he thinks about those 3.2 seconds every day, not just because they represent his worst moment as a human being, but because they also represent the beginning of his journey toward becoming the father Emily deserved to have. The park where it all happened still draws families every weekend. The playground equipment remains the same. The accessibility features that brought Maya and Isabella there in the first place continue to serve children with disabilities throughout the city. But now there's also a small plaque near the entrance, donated anonymously, that reads simply, "In recognition of the courage required to see past our differences and find our common humanity." Nobody knows for certain who placed it there, but most visitors assume it's connected to the incident that made this particular patch of grass famous for reasons nobody could have anticipated. Emily and Isabella still meet regularly, not just for their joint appearances at medical fundraising events, but for the simple pleasure of being children who understand each other's challenges and celebrate each other's victories. Their friendship, born in a moment of joy and nearly destroyed by adult fears, has become a testament to the resilience of childhood connections and the possibility of healing, even after the most traumatic interruptions. The story of what happened in Lincoln Park on September 15, 2023, continues to evolve as the children at its center grow older, and the adults involved continue to process the lessons they learned about themselves, their families, and their capacity for both harm and healing. It's a story that defies simple categorization, resists easy moral conclusions, and challenges viewers to consider whether the most important question isn't whether justice was served, but whether love, understanding, and second chances can coexist with accountability and the need to protect the vulnerable. 3.2 seconds. In the end, that's all it took to change everything. The question that remains is whether those changes represent justice, mercy, or something more complex than either concept can fully capture. The answer, like the story itself, continues to unfold with each passing day, each new choice, each moment when fear could either divide us further or create unexpected opportunities for the kind of healing that seemed impossible just 3.2 seconds before it began.